Good morning. Welcome to IISS. I'm pleased that we're able to start more or less on time. My name's Nigel Inkster. I'm the Director for Transnational Threats and Political Risk here at IISS, and it's my pleasure to chair this session by Frank Lavin, former U.S. Undersecretary for International Trade at the U.S. Department of Commerce, now working in the private sector on his own account. And the title of this talk, The Rise of China, 4 Questions. It doesn't actually say what the questions are. So at this point, I think I'm going to hand straight over to Frank and invite him to tell us what the questions are, and potentially even what some of the answers may be. Frank, over to you.
Thank you, Nigel, and I'm delighted to be back here again. And with Nigel hosted me last time, we had this talk on China, and I suspect it's going to be an ongoing theme of IISS and those of us in the room who follow China. There's some seats up front if you want to find a place to sit.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
Right. And I'm also proud as a member and supporter of IISS. So and living in China, I mean, I get the periodicals and I get the webpage, but to show up once a year or so and make sure that the house is run in an orderly fashion and it meets with my approval is good for membership discipline. So I'm glad on that basis to be here. Yeah, I should explain that the four questions, is really, think of it in the sense of Putonghua Sigawenti. Really 4 topics, right? Rather than 4 actual interrogatory points, but 4 themes we want to cover. And let me put this in context. Let me go to the four questions. The context is this. This is discussions Nigel and I have had, and John Chipman and I have had, that of all of the international issues the world faces, that the rise of China suggests, I think, the most consequential one for the 21st century. There's certainly other powers and other forms of behavior that can pose challenges, but there's no combination of both the gravitational weight that China has on the basis of its economic growth, which I'll touch on, and the fact that China is the only power that is still defining its role in the international system. That all other major powers, even those that people in this room might not, of which people in this room might not be enamored, have more or less defined set of activities and policies, and we'd say a mature foreign policy arrangement. China is very new to the international system. Historically, it's never been part of the interstate system, and foreign policy in China largely meant border state management. And so China is very sensitive and very shrewd about that set of activities. But if you read all of Chinese IR literature for several thousand years, it really doesn't go beyond what international relations means running the borders intelligently, keeping the barbarians away or setting up subordinate states, so forth. So this is the first time that China is not only fully participating in the international system, but is a leading power in the international system. So that was the context for the discussion today. And I said, within that context, then there are 4 questions that we need to think about, or 4 topics we need to think about that will help us, I think, better understand China's role. The first one is leadership cohesion. The second one is the economy, how's it performing. The third is social stability, the relationship between the population and the government. And the fourth is classical foreign policy. Right. And let me touch on each of these. Because Xi Jinping is wrapping up, I guess, 3 years in office, and I think we can give some kind of account about what he's trying to do, just to start off on the first topic. I think most notably, this has been a rather pronounced move toward concentration of power. That after the Deng Xiaoping era, we saw China move, not surprisingly, to a form of bureaucratic management, bureaucratic leadership, collective leadership. And this is, I would say, the most pronounced swing away from that model that we've seen. So we had, with Mao and Deng, we had 2 leaders who led on the basis of personality and their personal history and connection with the party and the revolution. And post that, we went to a bureaucratic era. And now we're back at the margins at least, to an era of personality where the number of times you see Xi Jinping's photograph on the front page of People's Daily, the people who have to write essays about him as their admissions essay for university, people who write poems about him. I mean, so it's a very pronounced swing away from what we saw, concerning other premiers and presidents, Wen Jiabao and so forth. It just didn't have that. Jiang Zemin just didn't have that kind of personality-driven leadership. So we've seen a concentration of power, and we've seen a personality-led push. And by the way, I would proclaim it as successful insofar as I've described it. I mean, he's carried it off. He's sacked generals. He's shunted aside others. Some that he deemed as political rivals or potentially troublesome were formally pushed out of power, have legal charges brought against them. Others have been more marginalized or subordinated, like Li Keqiang. I think he has a good working relationship with Li Keqiang, but there's no question about who's running the show and who's the subordinate. So I think it's been a successful series of steps. The question is, to what end? Why is he doing this? Is it an end in itself, or is he doing this? Is he concentrating power because he's going to undertake some additional reforms? That I don't have an answer on that. Nigel challenged me to give you answers. I don't have an answer on that particular point. I could simply say that what is happening is this move towards personality-led government. He's done it successfully, but we haven't yet seen the final chapter of this, and it's a question about the ultimate wisdom of this policy. Even though you can give him high marks for effectiveness in carrying it out. I'll say this: if you thought that he was going to face challenges internally, or that there was pushback or unhappiness or so forth, I don't see it. I don't see it. Of course, you normally wouldn't see it, but from his point of view, I think he'd say so far so good. The biggest look he's got. He went rather aggressively with a sort of anti-corruption push. I think that's slowed down a bit. He might say because, well, we've accomplished our goals, but in point of fact, it's not entirely clear to me how effective it was or what it did against corruption. There were at least three things going on with the anti-corruption push. One, I mentioned a minute ago. It's a mechanism for shutting down potential opponents and people you're not happy about, and he certainly used that. Two, it's a very important public statement because, and we'll talk about this more in the social stability, but he's making a public statement to the general population about the rise of the nomenklatura and the importance of the party leadership not being perceived as a class that is out primarily to enrich itself. So he's making he's reaching out, I think, to the general public in kind of a populist way, saying we're against sort of self-serving bureaucrats and party leaders, right? So, and then three, I think it's he generally is anti-corruption, but notably in the anti-corruption movement, at least there might be people who follow it closer than I do, but I haven't seen anything in his initiatives that were a systemic initiative, right? So there were proposals mooted about greater transparency, about forcing delegates to the National People's Congress to disclose finances or family members' finances. I mean, systemic changes that many other countries around the world observe. And none of those have been implemented. It's all been case by case, special prosecutor, special investigator, picking people up who have a lot of money, and there's some real jaw-dropping anecdotes about people who did quite well under the system through corruption, and sacking those people, imprisoning them, shooting them, and so forth. So there's been a fair amount of that, but it's not clear at all the system itself has changed, right? And some of this is sort of you could call a new Puritanism. It's not necessarily anti-corruption, but it's just against public displays of wealth. Let me touch for a minute on the economy. There are some seats right up here in the front row, guys.
Thank you.
Yeah, sure. Let me touch for a minute on the economy. Look, the model that China deployed successfully for 35 years to propel growth, which was taking advantage of low waiver rates and increased global trade liberalization to have and wise openness toward inward investment. That kind of model still has applicability, but not as much as it has over several decades. The leadership knows this. I mean, you read their speeches; they talk about not being able to rely as strongly on a export-driven economy, having to shift more to consumer-driven economy. They talk about reining in the SOEs, corporatizing rather than privatizing SOEs, but requiring the SOEs to rely on market reality rather than state subvention and open-ended support, right? But forcing these fellows to perform in according to market norms. So you'll hear a lot about that, the rhetoric. There's I think only been a few baby steps though in that direction about what kind of microeconomic reforms are being taken. I would give the Chinese government much higher marks with macroeconomic policy management than with micro. And you could say, well, every government in the world has that challenge, that it's easier to sort of get the budget right, it's easier to get monetary policy right, and it's a heck of a lot harder to go up against the state steel industry and to reset power rates and do all these kind of things that where there's vested interest and there's people's livelihood affected, and you have to do it 100 times over in order to have any considerable impact on GDP growth, right? But they know they have to do that. So I think we're all the data we see shows that there's a slowdown in the rate of growth, but still very much in the positive zone. I mean, very nice positive numbers out of China, but just off historic highs and off historic norms, even not just the highs. So it's a challenge for them, I think, politically, to say how can we keep these numbers up. So I've not yet seen indications that they're going to tackle some of these really tough things like the state-owned enterprises, like property bubble, like stock market bubble, and indeed, if you look at what's gone on in the last few months, you could say some of the monetary policy has contributed to stock market run up, right? Because I think they're doing the right thing by having a accommodating monetary policy. The trouble is if the money is deployed in the market rather than against actual economic growth, you get a bubble. So that's, I think, somewhat where we are. So I think, I'm generally sort of bullish on the Chinese economy, but there's going to be the mixture of good news to bad news is going to shift, I think, and there's going to be some amount of correction or pain in the equities market and in the real estate market. I have to tell you, this is hotly debated. I mean, my friends who follow this for a living are all over the map on this. So you'll find people who are still sort of bullish on this Chinese stock market, or say that the real estate market is climbing back up. The last few months there's been an uptick in top-tier cities real estate. So there's people on both sides of the argument. I'm a bit pessimistic on those sectors, but I'm optimistic in general on the economy. China's going to have nice numbers. But off of historic norms, which causes a little bit of consternation in Beijing. Let me touch on social stability and wrap up with foreign policy, and we can go to questions and answers. I mentioned before this view that one of the advantages of a very sort of public move against corruption is its really outreach to the general population about trying to push back against this view that the party's evolved into this sort of leadership class that isn't accountable, that is sort of self-serving, and has got a fair amount of corruption in it. And how do we bring back sort of management integrity to the party, right? So part of what he's trying to do is to position party leadership for general public acceptance. I'd give him little. I wouldn't give huge marks of success with that initiative. However, I'd say also I think there's a fair amount of social stability in China. So I'm describing two parallel activities that probably aren't limited just to China. But one, there's a fair amount of alienation in society, I would say. But I see that in the United States. I've only been in the UK for a day or so, but it seems to me there are entire political parties dedicated to alienation in the UK. So I've got to assume to some extent, by alienation, I mean if you ask people on the street, does the government help you? Does the government make your life better? Right? Are there government programs or activities that from which you benefit and you're glad they're in place? Or are these fellows just, sort of out from it's just jobs for the boys, right? They're just fellows sitting in their offices and God knows exactly what they do, and they're sort of rent seekers and people manipulate to see a system. But in general, a lot of what takes place in government just doesn't really help anybody. I mean, we could ask this question in the United States, and I think you'd get a sharp response. I don't know what percent, but you get a lot of people saying, yes, that's right. And you could certainly ask it in China, you get a lot of people saying, yes, that's certainly right. And I suspect you could ask it in the UK. You get so you have I think a high degree of alienation or cynicism about government role, and I don't think that Xi Jinping's initiatives have changed that. However, I'd also think you have a high degree of social stability apart from what the government does, because for several reasons. One, I mean, so the social contract I think holds very well in China, right? But it's not necessarily because the government's doing anything, but it's because sustained high levels of economic growth causes a fair amount of social stability. Secondly, the space for personal decision making continues to expand. I mean, you say I don't think there's been no material change, and there are no plans for any material change in the sense of democracy or organized in the direction of state, but there's extraordinary changes at the personal level about how people live their lives. And I think you could say that it is maybe more pronounced now in China than any time in Chinese history, people's ability to live life on their own terms. And so in that sense, China probably is in many ways like other mature Western democracies, that even if people are indifferent or toward the government or negative toward the government, they're saying it doesn't really affect social stability because they can do whatever the hell they want. Right, so government does what it wants, and I do what I want, and that's that. So you have those two parallel phenomena unfolding simultaneously. Look, and in addition, government still does control, domestic information. It still does have a repressive apparatus. It still can play to Han nationalism, which comes up in a lot of rhetoric and language. So there are other tools of the government has as well. But my point is, when we read these stories about protest or social movements or social issues, which are all sort of accurate. The question that comes from that is, well, is this going to lead to a broader reform or a broader political tendency, or is there sort of a move toward democracy, or is there going to be an Arab Spring? And my answer on all of those is no. No, there's certainly changes in China, but I think it'd be fallacious to interpret those as some kind of broad political movement as we've seen in other countries around the world. So high degree of social stability, at least for the near term on the current model. Finally, foreign policy. Well, I began my remarks today with a few comments to say this is the first time China's ever really had a foreign policy, first time it's ever needed a foreign policy, and it's new to the game. And it's a challenge for them sometimes. How do you assert your national interest, but do so in such a fashion that you don't cause any kind of countervailing movement, especially from neighbors? And I think that sort of summarizes China's conundrum at the moment, that it's an ascendant power. It's also a closed system, and that in itself is troubling to a lot of countries. And when they assert themselves, just that very fact is can cause a reaction in the region. It certainly cause a reaction in this city and in Washington. So that challenge of statecraft between narrow self-interest and enlightened self-interest, I think, is a challenge for all countries. It might be a particular challenge for China because of the nature of their political system. And by that, so the challenge from narrow self-interest to enlightened self-interest means, look, all states want to be able to project power and project influence, but I think enlightened self-interest means you do so in such a way that other countries, if they don't at least welcome it, they at least accommodate themselves to it, and they don't view it as troubling or a threat. But if you do it in the wrong way and you get that kind of pushback, you might have a self-defeating foreign policy. This is sort of a typical historical conundrum of the ascendant power, is that it asserts itself and it causes a reaction. And I said that this is maybe a special kind of problem in China because as a closed system, the ability for people to debate this point is very limited. The ability for someone to stand up and say, look, I'm not sure what we're doing with this particular push, and I'm not sure if it really helps us. The kind of debate, by the way, you'd have widespread in London, widespread in Washington, D.C., and I dare say any other capital, you just can't have in China. So when they get into a huge to and fro with Japan over the Senkaku Diaoyutai Islands, to say, well, in what way did that help China's national interest? And indeed, if we in this room were advising China leadership 10 years ago about what they needed to do in foreign policy management over this course of this decade, we would have said your number one goal in foreign policy management would be to attenuate the U.S.-Japan security arrangement. That would be your number one goal. And if you can allow that to atrophy or just weaken, China's in great shape for shaping the Pacific. And you'd say, don't worry about that because U.S. is going to have a lot of budget pressures. Japan's got demographic pressures. Japan also has this sort of incipient nationalism, which always comes and goes. So there's all sorts of great factors there that are going to push that alliance the wrong way or the right way from Beijing's point of view. And all we have to do is sort of let that unfold, and China's going to be better off. Well, I think they just weren't capable of managing that. I mean, that didn't play to maybe their domestic political requirements or other things they had to do. So they had to get involved in that tussle that strengthened the Tokyo-Washington alliance, and I think China came off the worst for it, right? So you see some of the same dynamics of the South China Sea with some territorial disputes going on and China asserting itself, and you say, but what is the end game here? What are you trying to accomplish with this? Now there are different theories. Look, my view is the nature of foreign policy decision-making in China is such that significant parts of its foreign policy are almost on autopilot. Somebody comes up with an assertive activity and nobody can say, let's not do that, or let's think about that, or let's think about cost-benefit analysis when we do that. And indeed, not only is there no off switch, there's an amplification effect, that if someone says, I've got an idea by which we assert ourselves, the other parties not only endorse it, but they have to say, well, fine, I'll do it even more thoroughly than you. So you have this paradox in foreign policy that your external goal is sort of equilibrium of an ascendant power, equilibrium in the context of projecting power, but your domestic goal is to always play that nationalist card, and it's difficult to strike that balance. I'll just conclude by summarizing of the three questions, so to speak. I'm generally optimistic, you could say, generally bullish on China in terms of equilibrium when it comes to leadership and economic and social stability, and I'm less optimistic when it comes to foreign policy. And there's just greater capacity, if you will, for mismanagement or miscalculation in that area than in the other three. So that's so I'm giving you partial answers, at least, Nigel,
okay.
to the four, and that summarizes the four. We can go to questions.
Frank, thank you very much indeed. That was quite a tour d'horizon, done without notes, and I wish I could perform like that. You've given us a lot to think about. We've got just over half an hour for questions and comments, and I invite you to pitch in. I'm going to start, if I may, by raising one point. You talked about social stability, and broadly speaking, I do agree with you. Perhaps the best thing the Chinese Communist Party has given most of its citizens over the last 20 or 30 years is the ability exactly to get on with their lives without being mucked about or interfered with. And yet, at the time of the leadership transition, and particularly in Chongqing under Po Xilai, we saw this move to mass mobilization techniques from the Maoist era. And we've also seen Xi Jinping demonstrating, I would characterize it as perhaps a certain amount of nostalgia for that kind of mass mobilization approach. Where do you think that sits now within the toolkit of the current leadership?
Yeah, it's interesting. First, I think you're absolutely right. Xi Jinping is extremely sensitive to his personal story, his family story. He is a child of the party. That is his base. So that's I think a core organizing principle of his decision making. And indeed, much of his rhetoric is oriented toward that. Much of his discussion, and he'll always begin a polished pronouncement by talking about core principles and Maoism and historical implication and things. So what's he saying? He's saying, I'm one of you. It is from you that I come, on your side that I stand. And I'll tell you, you can sum up his speech to the plenum in 3 words. I'm not Gorbachev. I'm not going to throw this thing away, right? We have to make some changes, fellows, right? But we're making changes to strengthen the system, right? So I'm one of you. We're not going to be foolish like those fellows up north, right? We're going to keep a good thing going. We're running the show. But we do have to make some changes. Everybody's got that. Because society's changed, technology's changed, globalization and so forth. We all sort of get that, right? So that's a very important sort of symbolic movement. This Bois-Lai episode is fascinating because my take on what he was trying to do was something a little bit different. That he was actively campaigning, right? And I think leadership found this very troubling. Apart from whatever differences they had with him anyhow, they found the fact that here's a fellow running for office. Here's a fellow who's actually organizing events and activities to put himself in the middle of the mix, and he's making himself a bit of a folk hero. And we said, this is really not the way the system should operate. This is very bad form, and what we don't want this to be is a slippery slope so that everybody's out running for office. And in our system, I suspect in the UK, it would be almost like a flag officer who's up for promotion saying, I'm going to organize a set of national events and activities and speak. And they say, well, look, this isn't intrinsically objectionable, but that is not how flag officers get promoted by giving. And we don't want a military where people are running around doing this stuff. So people would view this with disfavor. So he had a lot of problems, as we know. It's sort of like, whatever you can get away with is all right, but once you start sort of killing people, you've probably gone over the line. And for God's sakes, don't kill the foreigners, okay? Because they get fussy about this stuff and got to deal with it. So that was sort of, I think that's very different than what Xi Jinping's doing. It's interesting. It leads to this discussion, Nigel. What is Xi Jinping's ultimate goal? Where is he trying to go? And it's not entirely clear to my mind, but to always wear the cloak of party orthodoxy, I think, is absolutely vital to his political identity. And he will always put that robe on first when he starts any political discussion.
Yeah. So more aimed at the party than the people.
Absolutely right. Absolutely right. The cadres are his constituency.
Yeah. Okay, that's great. Okay, gentleman in the front row here.
My name is Syed Mahmood Ali. I'm a student of U.S.-China relations. Secretary Lavin, thanks very much for sharing your insights, illuminating us there. My question has to do with your last question about foreign policy. Given the indications we have that the United States is determined, successive administrations have said so, to maintain and sustain its systemic leadership into the indefinite future, and a similarly apparent determination on the Chinese side, certainly recent indications suggest, to assert China's interests, certainly in the Western Pacific, East Asian region. Do you see that these two powers can manage the transition into some sort of a new power equilibrium peacefully, or is conflict inevitable?
No, I'm generally bullish about this. Look, this is the fundamental foreign policy question of the 21st century, what you just articulated. Does the rise of China and China's desire to play a broader role, does it intrinsically mean friction or conflict with other powers, and notably the United States? I'm generally bullish that leadership on both sides are pretty mature, pretty sophisticated, have a good understanding of the cost of conflict, and can play a longer term game. Right, I'm optimistic. However, the capacity for miscalculation is there. So I don't see anybody in Washington. I don't see anybody in Beijing who is committed to conflict or views conflict as something that must take place in the course of this the rise of China. But the ability to get things wrong is always there. The ability to miscalculate and to have seemingly minor incidents escalate is always there. And that's a little bit troubling to me, because we look at some of these incidents in the South China Sea, and we look at these incidents over Sakaku, Dalyutai, and we look at even going back 10 years to the P3 incident, and you say, boy, none of these got high marks for crisis management, and they sort of continue to fester. They continue to go on today. So I don't think what the Chinese side completely factors in or completely prices in is this set of activities, that they might view these as isolated encounters, but outside parties are not going to view them such as that, and there can be escalation from that. There can be miscalculation with the escalation. So the need for better crisis management techniques and the ability to fully understand that what somebody might view as sort of necessary harassment or buzzing or whatever has a considerable risk to it. So you have to be very careful about this sort of malevolent state-directed activity, because things can go wrong very easily. And it's not sure. I was talking in the U.S. Not too long ago, and a U.S. Navy captain asked me why are PLA Navy ships harassing our ships in the China Sea? Why? I mean, what's the point of this? How does this help them? Was what was behind her question, and I, without being flippant, I mean, my response was, why not? I mean, these things are done by design. Somebody made a conscious decision to do this. It isn't that they were bored that day, but what this tells me that at the local level, there's some kind of bureaucratic payoff for doing this. That if you assert yourself, or you do something gallant or proactive, the system rewards it or respects it, or at least you're operating under those assumptions, right? So we'd say, look, that is terrible crisis management, right? But it might be just the way local teams operate. It might be done with the knowledge or approval of people upstairs, or, as I mentioned before, if there's no off switch in the system, people aren't really for this, they're not excited about it, they don't see a benefit for it, but it would require political capital to issue a directive saying, look, just cut this out, all right? We get no benefit for our country from this, and there's a propensity for some kind of mishandling. So we just want to stop this nonsense, right? But that directive has not taken place yet.
Okay, gentlemen, yeah, and fifth row, and then the fourth row, please.
Thank you very much. Craig Oldham from the Foreign Policy Centre, and I add my thanks for the overview you gave us. In terms of foreign policy and your sort of less upbeat and some cautionary remarks there, I wondered if you could say a few words about how you assess Sino-Russian relations at the moment. And I mean, do you see the sort of marriage of convenience being sustainable, or do you envisage a sort of a creeping friction coming in on that score? And I think particularly with regard to Central Asia and energy interests.
First, my take is it is 100% a marriage of convenience, that it has useful symbolism to it, and it's a way of maybe both parties a little tweak toward the West about saying, you might need us more than we need you, and so be it. But I've never heard anybody in China express a high opinion of Russian foreign policy, and I think they look at some of the things done and they, not quite aghast, but they say, I don't see where this fellow's going with his strategy, right? It's so in fact, I think you'd say that the typical Beijing view of Putin is not too different than the typical sort of Western or NATO view of Putin, that the guy's overplaying his hand and it's not clear what his ultimate advantage is for his country, and if he played his hand differently, he'd be a lot better off. You hear that all the time, that we're not going to be like that. But nonetheless, there's some utility in cultivating that relationship. I think you're exactly right as well. There's a limit of how far you can go because there's a natural area of competition for these two powers, and that's in Central Asia. And China's just got more cards to play, in my view. I mean, the Chinese economy is considerably larger than the Russian economy, and the Chinese economy can deal more competently with the needs of Central Asia, meaning low-end consumer goods, energy, exploration, logistics, the things that these fellows need fit in better. Now, they might find culturally better fit with Russia and see Russia somewhat European-oriented and so forth. So they might be just askance at the, if you're a middle power or a smaller power, you want to keep everybody in play, right? But so they're going to be a little concerned about the embrace of Beijing, but in general, I think China's just got a lot more to offer these states than Russia's got.
Okay, fourth row.
Yeah, actually, my question is partly related to, Harry Brown, Ministry of Defence, UK. In the context of Western sanctions on Ukraine and Russia's relationship with China, and you could argue in some ways Russia doesn't really have a choice except to turn east.
Right.
And what can Russia
Right.
give China that would want it to the Chinese to embrace it? One of the things potentially is assistance between the military-industrial complex, where where Russia still has an advantage in some areas, and that could be transferred.
There could be some, but I don't think there's any trust between those countries. There could be some, and there will be some, and I think you're right. They wanted to show other parties that you sanction us at your peril because we can collaborate. But I just think that's a finite exercise for both of them. There's a little upside for Russia, and it's a statement from China of saying, look, we are a pragmatic, neutral nation, and we're not going to join anybody else's crusade, right? But we'll just deal with countries as it's classical Chinese IR theory, which is to say, international statecraft is entirely determined by what that country can do vis-a-vis us, right? So there's no systemic goal for stability or balance of power or alliance. It's simply 100% self-centered. Which, by the way, it's not to criticize. It's not. To let you understand very clearly what China's thinking. So this is how China was on the Iraq War. China said, "Look, we're not going to endorse the UN resolution because we're askance at regime change. We don't like that idea. But we're not going to oppose it either, because how does it help us, unlike Russia or France or Germany, how does it help China to posture itself politically against the coalition? Why would we want to publicly oppose it? We're not going to publicly endorse it. We're not going to publicly oppose it, right? It's your fight. It has nothing to do with us. Right? So it was a very pragmatic, very self-centered view of foreign policy.
Okay, the lady in the second row.
Yes, Barbara Robertson,
Right.
formerly Warwick University, and I have I specialize on the Middle East and Islam. But over the last 15 years or so, China wanders into my area.
Yeah.
And so there was something I think and just following and reading a lot and so on, that previous chairman or heads of China didn't mind, were not worried, if middle-level individuals who were going to hold positions in the Chinese government didn't mind if they went to the States and got education. Didn't worry that they would be contaminated and bring it back. But the current man seems to have shifted on that.
Yeah.
He seems to not be so keen on that.
Right.
And I was just wondering what your take on
Right.
that was.
Well, I would say this ebbs and flows. What people can do or can't do, and who's allowed and who's not allowed, it does ebb and flow. And they'll come out with somewhat arbitrary, at least from a Western point of view, somewhat arbitrary rules that if you want to work for the foreign ministry, you cannot study overseas, right? Where it doesn't strike us as a very helpful way to go about it. But so they'll come out with these pronouncements, and then 2 years later they'll repeal the pronouncement, so forth. So this does happen. The long-term trend if you go back over 30 years, has been very positive, where in general they're increasingly accommodating or understanding or supportive. However, you're exactly right. Over the last year, it's been a bit of a chill. Over the last year, it's been a bit of let's be careful about Western ideas, let's be careful about Western contamination, let's be careful about this. And look, it's very tough to put that toothpaste back in the tube, isn't it? I mean, once you've sort of said we want a modern society and a modern economy, you've got to have some element of openness to that and some element of international connectivity to that. And once you say, well, but not too much, and we're going to calibrate it, we're going to fine-tune it, we only want the good international connectivity, we don't want the bad. I mean, it's very hard to do that. So, but you can see this is sort of, back to Nigel's question, he's playing to that constituency of folks. He's playing to the old guard who says, you know, people come back with bad ideas and they want to change society, and we can be very careful about this. So, I think this points to a longer-term contradiction. I don't think we'll see it manifest itself in 10 years. But over time, what happens is people are aspirational, right? And people do benchmark themselves against other countries and other behaviors, and people are familiar with other social norms and other political organizations, and they become restless, right? So, I mean, I think it's sort of a valid concern. I don't think it manifests itself in the near term. I don't think there's a challenge to the system in the near term, but if you go ahead 10, 20, 30 years, people are saying, what is the point of one-party rule? Well, how is that supposed to help us? All right, I think we'll hear more of that in the near term.
Yeah.
Nicholas McLean, a point and a question. The point is, when you mentioned the lack of reform in SOEs, I would sort of counter that by saying, to some extent, the SOEs have been bypassed by the government allowing considerable growth in the private sector.
I think you're right.
The proportion of the economy represented by the SOEs is much less now.
Right.
And even among the SOEs, there are some quite forward-looking ones, like CNOOC.
Right.
The question is, how far does the writ of Xi Jinping run at local government level, and can you differentiate between some of the places? Mention of Bolshoi makes one think of not only the corruption in Chongqing, but the gang culture.
Right.
And you find a number of other parts of China which are very different from what's allowed in Beijing.
Listen, first, I think you're exactly right on the SOEs. It's not make or break for China or for the economy to reform the SOEs. So you're right. They've got a very healthy private sector, and things bubbling along. But I think they realize saying some of these are just huge financial sinks. And I mean, we want an open-ended steel industry that hires millions of people, produces way over demand, doesn't respect market forces at all. I mean, why do we have this sort of corporate welfare system for literally millions of people? It's just extraordinary. And can't we? This is kind of a typical developing world issue, and we get it in the developed world too. Can't we, even if we can't quote unquote fix it, can't we at least get rid of the most egregious excesses in that system? So if we can cut the subsidies by 25% over the next, aren't we all just better off if we do that? If we trim some of the personnel at that place and shut down the most underperforming. So I think that's how he's looking at it, right? They're just saying, let's just tidy it up a bit. So they did require the major SOEs to combine. So they shrunk the number of SOEs and they consolidated them. And they ballyhooed this as a reform step. And I'm not quite sure how it's a reform step, but they've simply said we're putting them all together now. Maybe it becomes a reform step in the sense that this sort of ties into your second comment, which is you can put your own people in a more finite number of entities, and you can actually put in some management issues. Whereas if you have several hundred or several thousand SOEs, your ability to promulgate a reform measure is limited. And so, look, I think your second point is it's almost amusing, except that it's a little bit sad. But the point is, whenever you talk to someone senior in the Chinese system, it's always economic rationalism. It's always, we know we've got to respect market economics, we've got to get the system humming, we've got to let everybody compete, and we've got to really hit the ceiling of economic performance. And whenever you talk to the local fellow, he says, yeah, that's all right, you're absolutely right, but not here. We just can't do it today, okay, fellas, because we've got some other things going on. But you're completely right in the abstract. You're absolutely right. We need to do it. We just can't do it now, right? And I'm sort of running things here, and let me tell you how we're trying to do it. And so you've got this huge tension between economic rationalism and, call the other group, economic nationalism or rent seekers or whatever. That there's all societies are played with. But boy, you see this in China very dramatically, right? So it's victory at the margin. It's just at the margin, can we can we do something with power rates that moves them toward market norms? Can we do something that at least makes it easier for companies to start up and incorporate, or put some flexibility in the labor market? So if we can just make things easier at the margin, we're going to have better outcomes. And that's where you say where Xi Jinping is. So, but I haven't seen the big bang vis-a-vis the SOEs. I haven't seen that, and I get the suspicion he's not really going to do it. Yeah.
Okay, I've got 4, 5, 6 hands up, but right, I'll take gentleman in the first row first.
It's Masato
Well,
Kimura,
find
Japanese
everybody.
research journalist. My question is about Japan, and what is the Xi Jinping policy, foreign policy toward Japan? And secondly, what is a historical issue with Japan for Xi Jinping?
The question was about Xi Jinping's foreign policy toward Japan and the role that history plays in that. I think I'd view China-Japan foreign policy as overwhelmingly as a domestic political issue in China, that it's perceived by the domestic population as a historic wrong which has not been set right. And so there's enormous sensitivities in China to undertaking policy or steps that would appear to be a compromise or soft tone towards Japan. So in that sense, the leadership, I think, has some restrictions in terms of some constraints, I should say, in terms of how they deal with Japan. I have to say, Japan, to my mind, does not effectively play its cards either. I mean, it's got a difficult role because it has a domestic constituency as well, but it also has external. But the point is, you can finesse that, I think, if you're adept, and I don't think Japan hits the mark frequently. So it ends up hurting its own self-interest by odd sort of chest thumping or saying let's relitigate the 20th century. Let's go through the appellate process one more time. I just don't think that helps Japan, but it paints China in a corner as well. So I think you would say there's no current issues of friction. There's no goodwill there. There's a modus vivendi between the two powers. But China has shown over the last decade that it will dial up and dial down the friction, whether it's regarding Sakaku Jaitai or whether it's regarding Japanese economic activity in China, that it can dial up or dial down that friction as it chooses, and that's largely driven by domestic political requirements in China, and that Japan unfortunately plays almost a facilitating role to this by being ill-adept in responding or in setting the tone. Sorry for a rather harsh assessment, but that's my view.
Okay, gentleman in the fifth row there.
It's a question, sorry, Charles Vivian, a member of the Institute. It's a question associated with an earlier one. But one associates growth in an economy with the ability to innovate both in practices and technology. To what extent is China able, its educational systems and its social systems, to produce these levels of innovation in those areas?
Well, by the way, I think this is one reason why rates of growth are slowing down. Because if you said all we had to do 20 years ago was arbitrage very low labor costs, and all we're doing is making T-shirts and socks, there's no innovation there, but we're just moving up that chain. Now we're creeping into middle income status, and as you point out, you've got this potential for middle income trap where other societies are far more innovative, far more nimble and agile, creative, all sorts of things. So they can't quite hit that mark yet, but they can no longer really compete on a cost basis. And you have, for the last 2 or 3 years, at least 2 years, the China manufacturing sector has shown a decrease in employment. I mean, people are leaving Chinese manufacturing. It's not growing anymore. So you're going to Vietnam or Pakistan or Bangladesh or Cambodia for low-end activity, right? So China's got this huge requirement to climb up that value chain. Look, I think they're doing it. So they are improving. I mean, but your question, if I may restate your question, it's really sort of, are they doing as well as they could do it, right? And how much more rapidly could they go up that value chain, and how much better could they improve, and could they ever have their own Silicon Valley, or could they ever have their own automotive innovation center and specialty plastics and all these things they really need to be doing? I don't think there's an answer there. I sort of think yes, meaning what I've seen so far isn't bad. I work in the digital space and the e-commerce space, and there's a fair amount of cleverness, which I'll concede, sort of anticipating the criticism or the observation. It's more It's more cleverness of adapting things around the world for China or stringing some things together that already exist. Maybe some original inputs, but it's a lot of it sort of aggregating somebody else's ideas. But I said that's okay. I give them credit for that. That's frequently it happens in early days innovative societies. You're just adapting, right? But so I see clever people in the digital space, right? But I don't know. I think you and I will have to sit down in 10 years and say, did they ever get their automotive industry to a point of where they could do their own innovation? By the way, the huge problem they've got several problems. Education's a big problem, but one huge problem is this whole IP problem. That the opportunity cost and second order cost of not having strong intellectual property protection exceed the primary. I mean, the primary point is you get your intellectual content for free. You don't have to pay for anything, so it's fantastic in the short run. But if you don't protect an idea, you don't encourage people to have ideas. And if you can't monetize your idea, then you don't have an industry or culture that allows for innovation, right? And so one of the glorious elements of places like the UK or the US is there's a society that really respects ideas and will allow the inventor to properly achieve financial reward for that creativity. So as we say, the Silicon Valley of China is Silicon Valley. I mean, if you're a really smart fellow in China and you really can do, and there's no surprise, you better go to Silicon Valley and you will get money behind your idea and you'll protect the idea and you'll have a very nice life. And Silicon Valley in China is not there yet.
Okay, gentleman there in the third row. Yeah.
My name is Yuki from Japanese Trade Representative. My question is, how do you see the motivation of the Chinese setting up the AIIB? Or in other words, to what extent do they consider, the so-called enlightened self-interest?
I don't know how thoughtful. I can't speak to the intellectual antecedents behind it, right? I know that in talking to friends in China, ADB was viewed, I think, with some validity as a U.S.-Japanese consortium because it's been run by U.S. and Japan with general acceptance and approval across Asia, but have been run from inception by U.S.-Japan condominium basis. And so there was increasing dissatisfaction with that in China. What I can't speak to, maybe you can tell me, is to what extent China tried to change the system internally and to what extent the U.S. or Japan rebuffed or tried to offer proposals. So was there serious discussions that broke down? Or did China just decide unilaterally, look, the system is unfair to us, so we need to set up our own parallel structure? And I can't answer that. Do you? That story has not been written to my knowledge. Are you aware of any?
Maybe. Yeah, I agree with you. There's no formal view. Yeah.
Uh-huh. So fine, they went ahead and said we need to at least plant a flag here. We need to at least have some institutional capabilities that we direct or shape the outcome. My guess is when they launched it, they didn't necessarily have particular aspirations, but it caught people's imagination. And in the U.S., I think just handled it extraordinarily poorly. I don't understand why the U.S. Reacted the way it did. My view is, if I were advising the U.S., I'm not in government. If I were advising the U.S. government at this point, I would advise on areas like economic, trade, finance that we can. There generally can be win-win outcomes, and you can generally be accommodating to other powers. But in areas like Powell Mill, the outcomes are frequently win-lose outcomes. So you've got to be much more firm with potential areas of disagreement. So, but if you do that mixture right, you can have a happy outcome because you're signaling to the other party, we're not intrinsically opposed to you playing a broader role. We're only opposed to you playing a broader role if it impinges on our interest, right? So that's not a bad message to send to an ascendant power. But that is not what the U.S. did. So I think the U.S. fell short of the mark as well.
Okay, I've got 4 hands up, and I'm going to close the batting order there, and I'm going to ask...
Do you use batting order in cricket?
Oh, of course, my dear chap. Yeah.
Okay. You must have stolen that from us.
Okay, well, I'm going to take 2 at a time. So the gentleman in the second row, gentleman in the fourth row, and could you, each of you... Yes, I've got you, madam. Could each of you please be very brief? And we'll take 2 groups of 2 questions.
Okay, all right. Good, thanks.
From the Japanese scientific paper. My question is follow-up question of that AIIB. Do you think this kind of UK position of the engagement to the financial system, does it work? And what is your view?
Okay, we'll take the next one.
And the gentleman in the fourth row, yeah?
Raju from the Royal College of Defence Studies. I wanted to comment on the China-India relationship.
Could you please keep it very, very brief, because we've got two more. I want questions rather than comments, please.
And confrontation.
Right.
And right now we have a charismatic leader in India who
Right.
very successful
Yeah.
leader of China. So how does this relationship pan out in the next 10 years?
Right.
Thank you. Right.
Look, on AIB, I think UK handled it exactly right. I mean, it's sort of consistent with my previous point to say, look, if what's at stake is investment and finance activity, there ought to be an easy way to find a way to fit together, and engaging with China on those sets of issues makes a lot of sense. And look, to defend the United States, and this again is not a government I serve, but it was Clinton that was the first proponent of China's admission to the WTO. And I think that was helpful to China, but it was helpful to everybody to get China into a rules-based operating environment that gave them a stake in the system. So WTO was a success, and AIB, from their point of view, AIB, the way it was handled in the U.S., was not a success. The China-India discussion is almost worth a full seminar in itself. I give both parties high marks for trying to get it off on a positive foot, not collapsing into sort of historical patterns of competition. So they're setting the right tone. They're I think going an extra mile to say we're trying to find a way to be cooperative as possible. And there's certainly there's a trade, investment, tourism, etc. There's a lot that can be done. I think, though, the geopolitical rivalry over time is going to dominate those other areas. All right, but for the near term, or even on a long-term basis, I think the leadership is wise to say let's set as positive a pattern of behavior as we can, even if there are going to be very serious disagreements down the road. So I give Modi high marks for that. But the Chinese responded in kind, right? So good for them.
Okay, the lady in the fifth row there, please.
Hi, my name is Lei Wang from China Business Network Media and a correspondent to UK. My question is about, I'm not sure whether you have heard about One Belt, One Road strategic plan. So because it's a huge plan and basically bring a lot of overseas investment all over the Asia and Middle East and East Europe. So we haven't heard anything from Americans' reaction. So do you think they're going to have a certain kind of reaction in terms of foreign policy in Asia?
No, I wouldn't. Look, I wouldn't normally expect the U.S. government to react on a policy basis to that initiative. But look, this initiative strikes me as a very rational step for China to have as favorable an operating environment as it can build, right? And that means logistical connectivity is very important in its near or broad. So I wouldn't necessarily advise U.S. to respond on a policy basis to that initiative. But what I would say to Americans and to my friends in London is, look, it's a reminder that it's a new world, and there's a new planet in the solar system, and so gravitational forces are different, and orbits are different, and orientations are different, and historical relations, be it in Africa or in South America or in Central Asia or the Middle East, all these historical relationships are going to be under pressure because there's new competition, and so it behooves all other powers to get their game up as well, to be able to connect with friends and traditional economic partners in as propitious a way as possible, and not take any relationship for granted, right? And I don't think anybody can criticize China if they've got their act together regarding a logistics initiative. All that tells me is, look, United States, we need to get our act together as well. And what's wrong with signing Open Skies Agreement? What's wrong with enhancing GSP? What's wrong with other kind of, whether it's scholarships or other kind of initiatives that UK has a lot of cards to play, and the EU has a lot of cards to play, and the US and Japan all have cards to play, and don't be unhappy because somebody else is playing their cards.
Okay, gentleman in the third row on the right. No? Did you want to put a question? Mary, yeah, sorry. Yeah.
Mary Dujatski, I'm a journalist. I'd like to go back to what you were saying about corruption. Because I think in the past the interpretation of corruption trials in China has generally been that there is a political motive behind them. And Boris Guy fits perfectly in that category. But from what you were saying, it sounds as though you now see what's going on as being targeting corruption per se, without necessarily a political motive behind it.
Well, both. I delineated three things that are going on. I think any leader of any system is against corruption. Right, so just as a social good, we're against corruption. And so you set up a special group and you empower them and you say, go fight corruption. But I know in the same breath, but they haven't made any changes in any regs or laws or reporting. So I said, you're not going to really fight corruption, right? If you just give somebody a badge and a gun and say, go clean up, shoplifters in London, I mean, good luck. You're going to arrest a bunch of guys and you put it in the newspaper and you say, there, I did it. I've got 11 people I picked up today. So that's kind of what they're doing with corruption. Is it's almost reminds you of the Soviet grain forecast. They'll say 80,000 cases under investigation. I mean, just huge numbers, right? You have no idea what that means. But that's one pillar. Another pillar is, look, he's going after political opponents, rivals, people deemed not to be supportive. This is their, New Hampshire primary, right? I mean, they're just... So, that's that. And the third point behind this is it is a general public statement about don't view the party as a privileged class that is only out for itself, because we actually have a lot of integrity and we actually are here to help people and so forth. So they're trying to make that kind of a statement as well. So all of those things are in play.
Okay, thank you very much, Frank. I'm afraid we have run out of time, so I'm going to have to bring proceedings to a close and to carry on the cricketing metaphor, to draw stumps and head for the pavilion. Can I please invite you to join me in thanking Frank for a very comprehensive talk.